equality for us? What is liberty? What is fraternity? Then he delivered his personal message to Sarkozy, the French president. Moi, said Abdelaziz Jahouri in a ringing voice, moi, je suis la France. He might have added Europe for the profound alienation of many Muslims, especially the second and third generation of immigrant families, young men and women themselves born in Europe. If things continue to go as badly as they are at the moment, this alienation and the way it both feeds and is fed by the resentment of mainly white Christian or post-Christian Europeans could tear apart the civic fabric of Europe, most established democracies. We have also to be aware of those who suffer more serious identity crises, which makes it possible for them to identify with the ideology of anger and destruction, terrorism. These are serious questions we have to deal with. What is the identity? This is my third point. What is the identity of an immigrant? Well, I suffer from this myself with the Dutch politicians. They don't consider me European because I don't speak Dutch. This is the only reason. They reduce Dutch identity to speaking Dutch language. All the homegrown terrorists spoke European national language fluently. They were not integrated. Anyway, considering skin color and physical feature, the person identified as Black, African, white, Latin American, Asian, Arab, Indian, or Japanese. If religion is considered, he or she would be identified as Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, or atheist. So identity is not built on one essential factor. It has so many facets in its structure. But the problem in the history of Europe was, and still is, that immigrants are identified according to one single dimension of their complex identity. Before World War II, the Jewish people were only identified as Jewish, not as German Jewish, French Jewish, or Dutch Jewish. In the Netherlands, where I live now, and I have been living for the last 13 years, people who belong to different national backgrounds, Turkish, Moroccans, Iraqis, Surinamese, etc., are all identified now as only Muslim. This tendency to identify people according to their religion has increased since September 11, especially for those who has Muslim background. It does not make any difference whether those people are committed Muslim or not. Muslims, whether in Europe or the United States, are not hegemonic group. We should be very careful about any generalization. They are ethnically and culturally different, whether we speak about Muslim from the Indian subcontinent, from Southeast Asia, from the Middle East, or from Africa. Not to mention the European and the American, original Muslim and converted Muslims. Unfortunately, people tend to speak about Islam and about Muslims in a very naive and simplistic way with no history and no variation. Within the EU, the discussion about the European identity did not reach yet any conclusion, as we know from the debate about the European Constitution. In the polemic discourse about Islam, there is always the claim of one unified Europe, well-identified Europe, European culture, European values, etc., as opposed to Islam. So when it comes to Islam, Europe is well identified. Within discussion with European nations, there is no this kind of clear identity. What kind of Islam Europe is opposing? Here we can easily recognize the identification of Islam with all the negative non-European values. The challenging question is how to deconstruct these monolithic concepts in order to show the diversity of cultures within both Europe and Islam. How many languages Europe speak? And how much is the budget for translation within the European Union councils? How much the British or the French culture is different from the German or the Dutch culture? Europe seems to be well identified only in comparison with Muslims and in the face of Islam. How much here Europe is against its history and against its citizens? Again, I'm trying to avoid examples. The historical fact that Europe recognized its legacy, its heritage, through the Arabic translation of Greek philosophy before the original manuscript was discovered. And again, I mentioned how the Arabs were able to establish their civilization by integrating all the previous knowledge into their language, Arabic. In the 19th century, Europe have discovered for us Muslim, our thinkers, like Averroes and like Ibn Khaldun. So there is always this kind of, we have to realize that we know, that we don't know each other, we discover ourselves through each other. The most important way Islamic study is done in Europe. The Encyclopedia of Islam is produced in Europe. The Encyclopedia of the Quran is produced in Europe. The Quranic study started here in Germany in the 19th century. It is still continuing in so many universities in Germany. So the problem is not Islam, the problem is fundamentalism. And we have to think about, to deal with the problem as a problem, we have to stop dealing with the problem as a problem with Islam. Because this leads to theologize all issues involved. It is more than that encourage implicitly the claim of the radical Muslims, that all the problems of the world can easily be solved if people return back to the true faith. Europe has to remember that according to its modern values of human rights, it granted refugee status and political asylum in the 70s and the 80s for so many advocates of radical Islam for humanitarian reasons, being persecuted in their home countries. In fact, these protective humanitarian measures started as early as the 50s, when some members of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood Association were persecuted. Without undermining the values which provided protection for such individuals, those individuals were able to establish the mosques from which they propagated their radical Islam, which in the long run influenced the second and the third generation of the immigrant Muslims. Added to that, the international political situation. There is no time or space to deal with the complicated socio-political context which made this possible. However, Europe has to deal with fundamentalism politically, culturally, and intellectually, not to reduce it to be a security problem or to make it a theological problem. Religion is not a temporal phenomenon. Religion is not a fever. It's not a disease, as some new liberals claim. Religion is a very serious matter. It has to do with the meaning of life for its adherents and followers. We have to understand the rhetoric of the fundamentalist discourse in order to be intellectually able to combat it. What is the rhetoric of the fundamentalists, of the radical Muslims? Quoting Quranic verses and prophetic sayings out of context, thus implying meanings that appeal to the populace emotion. This is the major rhetoric tactic employed in the fundamentalist discourse. Secondly, employing slogans that can easily be memorized and repeated, such as Islam is the solution, Islam is a religion and state, headscarf is the female honor, death to the enemy of Allah, etc. Thirdly, stereotyping historical figures and historical events and glorifying the past as the golden era of Islam that could and should be returned to by simply returning back to the imagined faith and practice of the good ancestors. Last rhetoric tactic is the condemnation of any different opinion by labeling it as heresy or apostasy. We have to understand the discourse. We have to understand the tactic, not to repeat it, because all these quotations taken from the Quran by the fundamentalist is taken by the new liberal to say this is Islam. One of the Dutch new liberal thinkers said something about me. I would like to share it with you. He said, well, this Islam Abu Zayd is talking about is in his own head. He has to go and wash his head with a cold water. I did, but it didn't go away. So I said, sorry, my friend, it didn't go away. It's not in my head, it's in history. Combating fundamentalism by employing similar rhetoric would strengthen its logic and thus reproduce it. The rhetoric employed by radical liberal or radical rational European writers against fundamentalism does in fact validate its logic. By employing rhetoric slogans such as our culture, our civilization, our democracy, slogans which imply the incompatibility of Islam and these values. This is the same claim propagated by the fundamentalist discourse. Combating fundamentalism in Europe is not possible without realizing the importance of dealing with the original intellectual resources of their discourse, which is the fundamentalist discourse in the Arab and the Muslim world. You cannot disconnect Islam in Europe from Islam in the mainland of Islam. Now we are living in one village, this is a fact. Global village. You don't know where people get their ideas from the internet, from satellite, from everywhere. So don't think about European Islam, sorry. As long as the government of the Arab and the Muslim world control everything, economic, political, culture, corruption will always flourish. I'm talking about regimes who are supported by the West, by Europe and the United States. This is very possible. Only freedom can fight against this absolute darkness. Only freedom can lead to de-radicalization of the fundamentalist discourse. This is very possible when freedom is for all, including the Islamists. Freedom will uncover the meaningless of their rhetoric. They have to talk politics instead of manipulating the meaning of religion. We have to make use of all the possible means available by teaching, writing, debating publicly via public lectures, the press, radio, and TV interviews, etc. My major concern as a scholar is to show the historical fact about acculturalization. I am aware of the criticism directed toward multiculturalism. I'm talking about interculturalism, polyculturalism. Acculturalism, which means there is no such thing like autonomous, independent culture. I give examples from history. Every culture has to give and to take in order to keep alive. Islam and the West are just imagined concepts, while in history they invaded each other, integrated each other, even in fighting each other. I always take myself as an example. of the constructed identity. I'm Egyptian, yes. Arab, yes. Muslim. Which means that I carry in my vein, in my blood, multiple cultural components. Pharaonic, Greek, Roman. This came to Egypt. This is the history of Egypt. French, British, now American. So I am all of this, and I'm a Copt, as well as I am a Muslim. I studied and taught in the United States and Japan, and now I am in Europe. Of course, I taught in Egypt, and I taught in Egypt as well. Who am I? Am I an Egyptian, an Arab, a Muslim, or a European immigrant? I am all of these components, and should not reduce myself, reduce my identity into only one of these. My Europe, your Europe. I like very much the concept. I tried very hard to see who is talking to whom in this very short sentence. My Europe, your Europe. Yes, my Europe. I'm not European, but I belong to Europe. You're Europe. You are European. You belong to Europe. But I have the right to talk about my Europe. I have the right to be critical of Europe, as much as you have the right to be critical of Islam. Criticism is needed in order to instigate discussion, to open debate. Insult is not. To conclude, there is a need to deconstruct the simple one-dimensional notion of identity, such as European and Muslim, in favor of a complex, multi-dimensional identity. Second, rethinking the concept of boundaries, whether cultural, ethnic, or religious, should be a priority. The utopian concept of European Islam, propagated by some well-intentioned intellectuals, seem to be, for me, in odd with the global world in which we live. You cannot have Islam reformed in Europe if it is not reformed in the Muslim world. When someone in Jerusalem sneezes, the entire Muslim world will get caught. What are you going to do about this fact? This is a fact, whether we like it or not. This does not mean that there is only one single Islam, a claim which is historically incorrect. Islam has been colored and will continue to be colored by the diversity of cultures in which Muslims live. But to formulate a specific